Thank you for listening. This is the Wyoming Photographic Podcast, all things photography from the state of Wyoming, featuring Wyoming-based photographers as well as photographers who travel from all over the world to photograph this wonderful state. I am your host, Jeff Futter, and we have an amazing show in store for you. Thank you for joining us. We've got Rylee Jensen here to help us talk about wildlife photography. Rylee, how are you today?
I'm doing great. It's a really sunny day here in Marquette, Michigan.
Great. It's a nice day here too, actually. It's not too hot, not too cold, so
Good old fall.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am 26 years old. I'm originally from Utah, but I've kind of spent some time all over the place. I'm a wildlife nature photographer, a guide, a biologist, artist, and currently a graduate student right now going to Northern Michigan University. I've been a huge wildlife nerd for as long as I can remember. I grew up on Crocodile Hunter and vet shows and everything. So I got a bachelor's degree in wildlife ecology and management at Utah State University. So I'm formally trained as a biologist. I've done research projects on wild killer whale behavior, carnivore movements, and now herbivore gut microbiomes for my master's degree here. And these projects have kind of taken me all over the continent, from Washington, Michigan, Utah, Oregon, and Alaska. So kind of naturally with that, that's how I really got serious about photography too. So I've just really liked photographing the places I've been and the incredible wildlife and scenery that I've seen along the way too.
When did you get started in photography?
It was definitely when I was a teenager. I can't really remember if I had an aha moment about photography or when I first picked up a camera and knew that that was going to be my calling. I just kind of carried it wherever I went, around my neighborhood. I grew up near a little creek near my house where I would go catch garter snakes and find muskrats and stuff. And then my family would take a lot of camping trips around Utah. I would go to our local ponds. I visited Yellowstone for the first time in 2011. So yeah, kind of just it's just been a natural progression since I was a teenager.
Where are some of the best places you've ever been for photography?
I would definitely say Wyoming and Alaska have been some of my favorites, just because of the biodiversity and wildlife and ecosystems there. I just kind of naturally am drawn to mountains. So wherever there are really good mountains, I know that's where I'm going to be happy. So I kind of end up in those two places most regularly. But I've also started to expand to more international locations recently too. So I just visited the Galapagos Islands this summer. I did a trip to India this spring. And the first time I ever went to Africa was on a trip to Kenya with my dad in 2019. So I definitely want to see more places around the world and photograph animals I've never, encountered before.
Now, you're an expedition leader with the Natural Habitat Adventures. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Natural Habitat Adventures is a guiding company that I got hired on with this summer. They do expeditions all over the world. They're incredibly sustainable, and they have a strong mission about limited waste on their trips. And so I really liked their mission. And they're actually the travel partner organization with World Wildlife Fund. So I had heard about them for many years and had always had this dream of working with them. And then finally I got hired with them in June. So all of July, I did some back-to-back trips in Yellowstone and Grand Tetons, where I would lead groups for about a week, and then we would travel either from Bozeman down to Jackson or Jackson to Bozeman, vice versa, and just see the geysers and wildlife. We would do a float trip down the Snake River. So the experience itself was a really fun time. But I think one of the best parts about guiding in general, and especially with NatHab, is that a lot of the times I get to watch guests see their first wolf or their first bear for the first time, or their first moose, and then just seeing their faces light up. That always really gets me going. And so I'll probably be leading a lot more tours with them next summer, likely still around Yellowstone, but maybe also up in Alaska too.
So you were a guide at Yellowstone. What was that like?
Yeah, I was a guide with Yellowstone Vacation Tours based out of West Yellowstone. And ironically, I actually worked there during Yellowstone's 150th anniversary. So that was really special to just be there during that time. And it really was the best winter of my life. I was driving these huge snow coaches into the park. And I had some of the best wildlife counters I've ever had, like best photos I've ever taken. We saw wolves, eagles, swans, bison every day. It was just like truly magical. And I would definitely want to do it again.
What has been your favorite job?
I would say like guiding for sure. So I've guided in Yellowstone in Alaska with NatHab with various guiding companies. But aside from guiding, my science career has also brought about some really fun jobs too. I remember one summer in 2018, I was working in Eastern Oregon with a carnivore project. So my duties there were basically to track coyotes, bobcats, mountain lions, and black bears with radio telemetry sets. I got to drive ATVs around a forest every day, set up camera traps, and I actually got to help with some collaring operations too, which involves like, trapping the animal and then like fitting a collar on them, fitting ear tags on them. And it was really just such a hands-on immersive experience that it really got me it was like an educational experience in a way that I couldn't get otherwise, where like I really got to think like a wild mountain lion or like how they would anticipate their movements, like where they would be at a given time of day, where like these black bears travel, that sort of thing. So it was like I really got to just play around in the wild all summer long and really feel like I was immersed in that for a while.
We're at in Eastern Oregon.
It was this place called the Starkey Experimental Forest, just outside of La Grande. So I was staying at a bunkhouse up there, and it's technically like a big fenced-in enclosure because they were studying elk and mule deer in the 80s, but the carnivores can move in and out of that fence pretty easily. So we were just setting up camera traps to mainly document their movements around the place.
I know exactly where that is. I'm actually from just south of Pendleton. So,
Oh, really? Yeah.
yep.
Visited Pendleton a couple times that summer.
So, yeah. So, who do you get your inspiration from?
Definitely as a kid, I remember looking up to um, a couple like main photographers. So one of my favorite shows was the show called Big Cat Diary, and there was three photographer hosts there. So Jonathan Scott, Simon King, and Saba Douglas Hamilton. They would follow around like a pride of lions or a specific cheetah family or certain leopards around the Masai Mara in Kenya. And I just thought that was like the coolest job ever. Like I wanted to do exactly that. And just seeing their like passion and excitement over tracking these cats was like really infectious. I wanted to like do that on my own, even just like around my neighborhood, like looking for tracks or looking for signs of animals. And now too, I get my inspiration from a lot of my own peers. So I'm with this organization called Girls Who Click, which is it provides really good mentoring for young women trying to get into wildlife photography or just photography in general. And I've learned a lot from the other ambassadors in that program, like Erin Ranney, Joe Davenport, Leanna Nixon, Dawn Wilson, my mentor. So that's been a huge source of inspiration from me, just seeing other women my age kind of like really make their own way in photography and find their own niche. It's been like pretty inspiring.
So, let me ask you, what clothing do you recommend for photographing nature?
It really depends on the season and the location. So, for example, in like spring and summer in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, definitely breathable layers, a sun hat, definitely bug nets too. Wherever you go, you never know when they're gonna come in handy. And then in the fall and winter, if I'm there, still more layers, but maybe like warmer layers, a down coat I like always bring with me, and insulated boots too. Even if I'm just planning on kind of doing a lot of like roadside photography that day, I might like head off on a trail. So I just want to have boots handy. Alaska, I've learned to just have a really heavy duty rain jacket and pants just all times of the year. It's just constantly wet and rainy there. And honestly, wherever you go, just having backup clothing if you go out for more than a couple hours, because you never know if something's going to get wet. And so you don't want to be wet and cold, and just having those, just being prepared in that way.
Absolutely. And are there any specific places you like to go within Yellowstone to take pictures?
Pretty much every time I would go to Yellowstone, when I was like more based in Utah, I would just go straight to the northern range. So driving up to Gardner and then driving that northern range road back and forth between Gardner and Cook City. There's hot spots, like Lamar Valley, which is the best place in the world to see wild wolves. So I would usually just spend most of my time there. And apart from wolves, I've also really frequently seen black bears and grizzlies in the spring and summer, just foraging on like really close to the road, actually, sometimes too. And lately, whenever I go there too, I also try to find some of the more like overlooked critters like badgers, bighorn sheep, mountain goats, weasels, which sometimes they don't always have like set locations that they're going to be, and they're not always as predictable. So it's good to like challenge myself in that way and just try to find something new every time I go up there.
Can you give some advice for getting tack sharp wildlife photos?
Yeah, I would say definitely knowing how to use your manual settings. So practicing a lot in test settings like your backyard or your local park where it's not really like super high stakes and you don't have to like quickly change between scenes. But also just taking into account really mainly the lighting of a scene as well as the type of action that you're going to be photographing. So whether it's like really fast paced or maybe your subject's more still, and also distance too can sometimes affect the different settings that you use. So for example, if it's really low light, you might want to turn down your shutter speed and aperture to let in more light and then turn up your ISO potentially. Whereas if it's like high action, you're obviously going to want to turn up your shutter speed and aperture to like make them more crisp than if you were to have more like blurrier action shots that way. And sometimes with long distance too, what I typically do is turning up my aperture and ISO to include more details, and sometimes using manual focus over autofocus to really get the details in a scene that you want to be crisp and sharp.
What would you consider to be your biggest photographic failure? What did you learn from it, and how did you overcome that experience?
I actually have two moments that jump to mind, and they're not even really moments; they're like entire trips, unfortunately. So the first internship that I did in Washington during the summer of 2015, it was kind of the first time that I stepped into the world of like wildlife biology and collecting field data and just being out every day with wildlife. And so obviously I brought my camera along. And with killer whales, it's not the same type of photography as being in Yellowstone, where your subject is, constantly you're constantly watching like a bear or a wolf. Killer whales obviously only come to the surface every once in a while. So in my mind, that I was thinking, okay, I'll need to use manual focus because I never know where they're going to show up, and then I can just switch the camera to like get them in focus right away. But that was a horrible idea. They all turned out like most of my photos from that summer turned out pretty blurry, unfortunately. So the next summer I went back and used autofocus, which ended up being so much better. And then the second example is when the first time I went to Kenya in 2019, I bought a brand new camera and a brand new lens for that trip, which I used for several years after that. But I didn't understand the beauty of shooting in RAW at the time. I just didn't really get it because I would look at my photos after uploading them in RAW and be like, well, they look not as great as when I shot them on scene. Like, I don't understand why they look more dull. So I just shot in JPEG the whole trip, which wasn't a huge deal. But now I realize I have limited capacity on how I can edit those photos. So that's kind of unfortunate, but that kind of helped me understand like RAW is the way to go from here on out.
And with that being said, what would you consider to be the best photo you've ever taken?
That's a good question. I don't really know if I have a photo that I consider the best, but one that jumps to mind that I'm most proud of was taken during January 2021. So this is when I was doing those Yellowstone tours. And there was one day we had an encounter with the Wapiti Wolf Pack in Midway Geyser Basin. We were on our way to Old Faithful for lunch, I believe, and we were just coming around the corner and we saw the whole pack just kind of making their way across these steam vents and fumaroles and geysers. And it was such a perfect, like, scene that can only be captured in Yellowstone. So we pulled over, and I got some pictures of the pack howling together and rallying and just traveling across this geyser scape, with steam vents like rolling up behind them. So I really love the pictures I got from that encounter with wolves and geysers together. It's just very like reminiscent of the spirit of Yellowstone, and it's one of the most like unique sets of photos I have in my catalog.
Now, to get a wildlife photo, have you ever put yourself in harm's way, whether on purpose or inadvertently?
No, never. Whether that's like approaching a subject too closely or like putting myself like in adverse weather conditions that I know I'm not going to be safe in long term, like I just avoid those situations at all costs. Mainly because I'm more concerned about encroaching on an animal's personal space bubble rather than like them, you know, in fear that they're going to like harm me in any way. I've never really felt unsafe in the presence of wolves and bears. And a lot of that comes down to just reading their body language and being respectful. So it's almost like asking permission to approach before, coming up on a scene. I try to do that. And also just knowing my limits too. Like if I know I'm not going to be able to like make it through a hike, whether I don't have enough food or water, or I'm just not prepared for the elements, like I'm just not going to risk it that day for a photo. And I can always, come back to that spot and try again.
Oh, good answer. What does your typical routine look like to go and take photos?
Okay, so I'll use the example of like going out in Yellowstone in the Tetons. Typically, this involves me waking up pretty early, so around like 4:30, 5 a.m., getting all my gear ready, getting all of my clothes ready for the day, waking up either in a hotel or the back of my Subaru sometimes. And then basically I'll just drive roads back and forth until I spot something, because early morning hours are the best times for wildlife. So you want to be there when action is best. So I'll listen for, coyote yips, wolf howls, raven calls, alarm calls, breaking branches, depending on the day. If it's kind of slower, that's when I'll like pull over and listen for things. But usually I have a lot of luck just like being out on the roads, and putting myself in those places that I know I'm going to see the most, or where I can stop and wait for something to happen. So after that, I'll usually take a break around 11 a.m. or noon, depending on the action. Take some time to edit some photos, get lunch. Because typically in the middle of the day, it's usually warmer, depending on the season, and wildlife isn't going to be as active. That's usually when most animals bed down. So I'll resume around late afternoon or evening just to see if anything else is kind of stirring, or if there's, more action going on kind of towards the cooler parts of the day.
So you're a lot more patient than I am. I'm I'm not a good wildlife photographer, and most of that is because I'm not very patient. The other day, though, I got pretty lucky. My 7-year-old son was home from school sick, and he comes up to me, Dad, there's a dog in the yard. Really? Okay, so I go and look. There's a coyote out there.
Oh,
So
nice.
awesome. So I grabbed my camera. I got some pretty decent pictures of it, but for the most part, I'm not a wildlife photographer just because I don't have the patience that you do.
Yeah, it does require a lot of patience and sometimes just luck too. Like, I can put myself in a lot of these situations where I'm like, okay, like I've seen wolves here before, or I've seen like a fox or a coyote here before. So I'll just like wait and see if something comes back, or if they are doing their normal like patrols or something like that. But sometimes I just have surprise wildlife encounters that show up out of nowhere. And I feel like some of my friends sometimes have better wildlife luck than I do. Like, I'm not really superstitious, but it's fun to kind of joke about like luck in the field, because sometimes that's just what you need.
How do you display your photos? Do you display them in frames, acrylic, metal, prints, canvas?
Yeah, kind of all of the above, depending on what people like. So when I'm displaying photos in, say, like an art market, for example, I'm actually going to be doing a holiday market here in Michigan in a couple months, but I'll usually display them in frames, and I'll print them as like a photographic luster paper. So people usually like that just because they're, ready to go and hang on your wall. Canvas was really good for that too. Sometimes people really like the texture of canvas and just how you can encompass the entire photo on all edges of the canvas as well. And actually, I really do like how my photos look on metal. It just kind of brings out some like color and contrast that you can't always get with prints or canvas, but they're also pretty expensive to produce. So I have a handful with me that like I'll just hang in my room during the off season of markets, I guess you could say. But I really do try to like get those out there too.
And how do you sell your pictures, whether prints or canvas or whatever they are? Do you sell them online typically, or are you featured in any galleries or
I would
any?
love to be featured in galleries one day. So currently not any yet, but I do have an Etsy shop where I work on like updating it with new photos that I've taken throughout the year. I'm trying to convert to selling photos on just my website alone so that you don't have to go through like a second party on Etsy to get them. But that's the main shop that I have. And then I also do sell prints in person at art markets and fairs throughout the year when I can too.
What's your favorite time of year?
Um, Aside from winter, which like comes with all sorts of creativity. Actually, yeah, I would say winter is probably my favorite time of year to shoot. There's cool weather, there's less heat waves, more active wildlife, really beautiful scenery. And I feel like photographically, I can find a lot of creativity in simplicity. So with like a white canvas, you know, your subjects usually stand out a lot better. Um, and it just creates really beautiful scenes and a lot of scenes that you obviously wouldn't be able to get in like the summer or fall with lots of, you know, colorful vegetation and things going on. Sometimes the winter is just really simple and kind of creates these like artwork type photographs.
What kind of challenges do you face shooting in winter?
Um, Mostly like physically withstanding colder conditions, whether that's like me personally just needing to layer up, or sometimes it's too cold to really do much outside. And also, camera batteries don't really last as long in cold weather. But also with um, shooting outside too, sometimes you get condensation issues on a lens. So especially with shooting inside a vehicle, like I learned doing snow coach tours, you're getting a lot of heat waves and exhaust that's coming off from the car. So that can translate into heat waves in a photo too. So I usually just carry around a microfiber cloth to wipe my lens with. And then typically early in the day too, I'll balance out the temperature by turning off my car if I come up on a scene to just try to let some cool air in and like reduce that condensation.
And one thing I learned is when you're hiking, don't carry your camera in the camera bag in the winter because as soon as you pull it out, it's covered in condensation. If you just leave it
Right.
out, then it's all
Yeah.
right. But I had to learn that the hard way one time.
I even learned that in the Galapagos this summer, which is the complete opposite type of condensation because it was so humid there. So before we went out on a hike or something, I would just let my camera lens like sit for a little bit and let that condensation kind of naturally disappear.
How did you get so good at wildlife and nature photography?
A lot of that just comes from, I mean, with any field, like practice, practice, practice. Like with art too, it's just you find your own techniques and creative outlets and creative techniques. A lot of it, I think, also comes from just learning from my friends and just seeing the different things that they experiment with. And when we're out in the field together, it's really fun to see how maybe even if we're shooting side by side at the same animal, how they end up like editing the photo differently, or maybe how they capture the scene differently. If I'm zooming in and maybe they're zooming out on the environment and the animal together, that just kind of creates a fun dynamic. So then, like maybe in the future, I'll try that same technique in a totally different scene.
Do you prefer color or black and white photos?
Personally, I prefer color. I just think it gives my photos more life. I really like playing around with greens and blues. And personally, I just try to keep my photos as true to life as possible. I think black and white is great if you're going for a more artistic approach. And sometimes that brings out a better mood in photos if you're playing around with highlights and shadows and the contrast between them. Maybe I just haven't really played around with black and white very often, but usually I try to stick to color.
If you could go back to when you first started photography and give yourself one piece of advice, what would that advice be?
I tend to have a perfectionist mindset in all things that I do. So that also applies to photography. I try to like make my scene absolutely perfect before taking a photo, or like not taking a photo at all if I know that like my settings aren't going to make it look like exactly how I want. And I did that a lot in the early years when I was just starting off with photography. But I would probably just tell myself, like, just don't worry about it. Just take the photo, and then it's fine to mess up and try new techniques down the line. And sometimes that actually helps me become a better photographer now, is looking at my old photos that maybe didn't turn out the way I wanted them to, but then sitting and thinking how I would have done it differently, or what settings I would have used differently, or how I would have composed it differently. So sometimes your mess up photos actually are the ones that help you progress and get better.
Yep, for sure. Now, do you strictly photograph in the wild, or do you take pictures of animals in captivity as well?
The photos that I post and the photos that I really get out there are the ones that are taken in the wild. But I also do believe that photographing captive animals can be a good practice for photographic techniques. So, for example, during that winter that I was in Yellowstone, I bought myself a Canon R5. So it's a mirrorless camera. It's has new kind of controls than what I was used to using on a DSLR. So I took it to the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center in West Yellowstone and just practiced on the captive bears and wolves that they have there to just, once again, it was kind of like a low stakes setting. They're always going to be there. So I didn't have to worry about missing a scene or missing a shot. I could just go in and practice with it on actual wildlife, but in a setting that I could feel more in control of. And so that's one way that I'm like photographing captive animals can be a good thing. Also in the Galapagos, I photographed captive tortoises at the Charles Darwin Research Center to kind of document their breeding program and talk about that in my social media posts. So I kind of have mixed opinions on like zoos and aquariums, whether they're like accredited or like the ethics behind that. But especially with research centers that are working with, captive breeding or releasing animals back to the wild, that's something I definitely support. So that was kind of a unique experience to just see what they're doing down there and how that program is run.
How do you approach a new location you haven't shot before?
Really, I just plunge right in. um, so I guess one example I have too goes back to the Galapagos. I rented a GoPro to do some underwater photography since I knew that we'd be snorkeling a little bit down there. And beforehand, I'd obviously wanted to figure out the technical controls and settings that I wanted to use on a GoPro before just like opening it up in the water and just trying it there. But then once I was there, I just had a lot of fun with being in the moment, and then kind of photographically, those pictures and inspirations just came naturally from practicing it and trying it out, and not really worrying too much about the scene itself. So like once I was comfortable in that physical environment, just getting out the GoPro and kind of just taking as many photos as I could and seeing like which ones worked one day, and then coming back the next day and trying it again, or trying new techniques that maybe I didn't before.
What is your favorite lens for wildlife?
Definitely my 100 to 400 millimeter lens. It's a f4.5, so it has a pretty good aperture. And honestly, for the wildlife that I photograph, I think 400 millimeters is pretty much all I need to zoom in on my subjects adequately. I can always like crop later on, but it's a full frame sensor on my Canon R5 too. So I have a lot of fun in the field with this. I consider it a big lens, but it's not like unbearably heavy to carry around in the field either. So I just take it with me wherever I go.
And the R5 has a really good resolution, so cropping isn't too much of an issue.
Mhm.
What type of wildlife do you typically find in Wyoming?
So many animals. Kind of like what I mentioned before, I really am drawn to Wyoming because of the biodiversity that I find here. So usually when I'm going up to Yellowstone or the Tetons, I obviously have, the big animals like wolves and bears on my mind because I can't really find them easily elsewhere. Like when I'm based in Utah, there's no grizzly bears in Utah or wolves. So Yellowstone is usually where I go for that. But over the years, after learning about the ecology and natural history and ecosystem roles of a lot of the smaller animals, that's a lot of the time what I go to find now too. So like pine martens or pikas or Canada jays, Clark's nutcrackers, beavers, otters, all sorts of little like mesocarnivores that are often overlooked compared to like the big five of Yellowstone, like bison and wolves and bears and elk.
Do you shoot during storms typically, and how does that affect your photography? How does it make it potentially better or challenge you?
I really love shooting in storms, actually. Obviously, it kind of is a challenge with distance wise. So, if your subject is like out in a storm, it's going to be pretty hard to get them in frame or to get them in focus. But it challenges me physically, obviously, with just staying warm and trying to like keep my gear, adequate for these conditions. And also, technically, just finding the right settings on my camera to play around with like us in the snow or in the rain. But some of my favorite photos I've ever taken have actually been in storms. So I have photos of eagles and bison and blizzards with huge snowflake textures and snowflake patterns in the background and in the foreground. And then up in Alaska, I have a lot of photos of bears in the rain. And it really creates fun fur textures when they're shaking off rain from their fur coming out of a river. So I think storms really can help enhance photos too, if you know what you're doing.
One thing I love about it is usually during a storm, there aren't so many people out.
Yeah, that too. Get some things to yourself.
What other types of photography do you like to shoot?
Uh, Lately, I've kind of been experimenting more with landscape photography. So last spring, I went down to Antelope Canyon with my family and got to play around with shadows and texture and light in these slot canyons. So Antelope Canyon is that place in Arizona where a lot of people go to get light rays coming down from these red rock slot canyon walls. So that was really fun to just try out a whole new technique that I've never tried before. And just capturing different ecosystems too, I'm trying to get better at as I learn more about the ecology of, say, rainforests and tundras. I want to try to capture photos there that really tell the story of those ecosystems and capture them in the best way of how I'm looking at them in person and just trying to keep that true to life photograph intact.
How do you avoid burnout? Do you have any other hobbies or interests that help with that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely moments where I just like times of the year where maybe I just feel like my photography is just not going well, or I'm just tired of like the photos I'm getting. I just don't feel like they're quite up to par. So sometimes it really helps to just step back and take a break from photography for a little while. So this stint actually in grad school has been pretty good for me because I'm like focused on, my studies. I can dedicate time to some other hobbies I have, like reading and painting and just doing hikes around here, around Marquette, without feeling obligated to bring my camera along. And sometimes that actually helps stir creativity down the line when I'm out in the wilderness or in a new ecosystem and I don't feel the need to um, take like take home 10 photos from that day, for example.
How do you use lighting and composition to capture mood and emotion in nature photography?
So, going back to what I was saying about capturing the story of an ecosystem, I try to compose my photos that will tell a story in the best way. So, whether that's including multiple subjects in the same photo, like bears and salmon, for example, or like eagles on a carcass, um, other environmental elements that might lend some support to this story. So, I keep going back to like Alaskan rainforest because there's just like such a unique like element of that ecosystem that a lot of people don't realize with trees and like how salmon impacts tree ecosystems. And so maybe capturing salmon and bears, but then also these like mossy trees in the background to kind of lay the scene. Or whether that's capturing a certain behavior too that I really want to highlight. For example, like in the Galapagos, I remember one photo I took was of a blue-footed booby on a nest. And I just took a picture of the bird's feet with the eggs around it. And that way it could kind of help highlight like the conservation issues surrounding blue-footed booby reproduction down there. So I kind of wanted to highlight that. And I took that photo very intentionally with that purpose. And then in post production too, sometimes I'll edit photos in a way to make them more moody or more whimsical, depending on what I want to convey in that photo too.
What are your thoughts on how AI is changing the state of photography right now?
Ooh, good question. I know it's very controversial right now. As a grad student, I find it awesome because I can enter in like prompts for my research that might help me with like some code. As a photographer, though, it kind of gets a little bit more blurry. There's kind of more of a gray area, though. I like the idea of entering in prompts that can stimulate ideas, for example. So, like, if I'm thinking of a new writing piece or of a new like theme of photos that I want to go out and get, AI can maybe just kind of help boost my brain a little bit in that regard. But I'm not a huge fan of like copying and pasting those prompts directly into say like photo captions. I just feel like that kind of dampens creativity and credibility a bit. And obviously, I'm not a huge fan of AI generated photos being passed off as real photos either, because that just kind of brings in to question photographic integrity. And that doesn't necessarily pertain to adjusting small features like twig removal from a picture, which, like, sometimes I do. I'm talking more like large scale changes like new environments and adding subjects that weren't there before. But I also kind of have the opinion or have the mindset that AI is here to stay. So we might as well just kind of start looking for ways to adapt to a world where that's reality. I'm not really sure what that means for photographers and artists long term, but everyone still has the capacity to create meaningful art and capture beautiful photos that are true to life and honest. So I think that's really the way we should be looking for in the future, is just having an online presence that's genuine and honest with your photos.
One of my biggest concerns are all the free AI watermark removers out there. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
photographers will watermark their images and put them up on a website to sell prints or even distribute watermarked photos for portraits or something like that. So a customer, instead of buying the prints, can just remove that and print it out themselves.
Yeah, that's unfortunate too, because I did watermark my photos a lot a couple of years ago, and like thinking that was a foolproof method, but obviously, yeah, people can crop them out or edit them and remove them. So it's hard to know what to do sometimes.
What is your favorite animal out there to shoot?
I'd say maybe not one animal in particular, but a group of animals. I find canids really fun to photograph. So in Yellowstone, you have wolves, foxes, and coyotes, and they each have their own personality that I like to bring out in those photographs when I come across a scene with some of those animals in there. So, like fox kits, for example, they have hilarious facial expressions when they're playing with each other or when they're greeting their parents after they come back from a hunt. So I try to photograph like them playing together. They're really bouncy and it can make for some great action shots. Coyotes, sometimes it almost seems like they're intentionally posing, so they can be really majestic on a landscape. So I like photographing coyotes a lot too. And then wolves, of course, are like one of the most iconic animals in Yellowstone, if not like the most like the animal that people think of when they think of Yellowstone. But they can also be really great models for environmental shots. So, kind of going back to what I was saying about the wolves next to the geysers, that kind of is a photo that could only be taken in Yellowstone and was only possible because the wolves were so far away, which oftentimes happens when you go to Yellowstone. The wolves are going to be, maybe even a mile away. So you have to get creative with how you photograph them.
What is the best time of day for wildlife photography?
Definitely early morning. Just everything about it kind of brings together these photographic elements that I just love. So you have alpenglow on the mountains. The light is really soft and easy. Wildlife is really active, so you're going to get a lot of movement and activity from wildlife that way. But then also it's just really still and quiet. You don't really have the like hustle and bustle of a lot of people on the road yet. The weather is even cooler. So I feel like mindset wise, it's just like a more peaceful time of day to be out there too, as the sun is coming up. So you can, it's not like you even have like a timer where in like the evenings, you have to leave once it gets dark. You can kind of stay out there as long as you want, depending on the scene that you're capturing at that time too.
Do you teach any workshops or lead any photo tours? And can you recommend any good workshops?
Yeah, so apart from natural habitat adventures, which obviously I'm a little biased towards, but they really do have genuinely good um, photo-based tours all over the world. So if you want to go for more of like an expedition, you can do that. Or if you're looking for a more photography-based tour, they also have those options in the same locations. So I think they're a fantastic company to go with. But also funny, you mentioned that me and my friend Kevin Andrews are working on starting up this guiding company called Ursus Expeditions. And so he recently has been on this mission to see all 8 bear species of the world. And he's made a lot of contacts along the way and really gotten to know these bears and the ecosystems that they live in and kind of learned about the conservation issues that they're facing too. So he and I together want to begin leading tours to find all 8 bear species of the world and educate people about their unique situations. So there's, sloth bears in India, sun bears in Borneo, grizzly bears, brown bears in Alaska. So there's all these different ecosystems and environments that they live in. And we thought it would be a really great idea to educate people about some of the lesser known bears too, like Asiatic black bears or sun bears, which a lot of people may not know about. So we're still kind of working out the kinks for that. But like as of today, so as of September 28th, we're working on building our website and we'll probably have tours coming in 2024.
Nice. What are some questions you ask yourself every time you take a photo?
A lot of what I do when I come up to a scene with an animal is I try to anticipate that animal's movements. So I kind of am constantly asking myself, like, what do you think this animal is going to do next? Or where can you position yourself to get the best photograph based on what that animal's doing? So sometimes it's just, a wolf, like, just moving right through a scene. And so with that encounter I had with the wolves and geysers, I actually left the wolf pack that we were watching parallel to us and kind of moved up ahead so that we could catch them up later on. So sometimes it involves things like that. I also ask myself, like, how should I line up this scene to capture everything I want? Whether that's, do I want a bigger environmental shot? Do I want more of a close-up photo of this animal in particular? And then sometimes what even goes through my head is like, how can I crop this later? Or like, how can I capture all the elements in this photo so I can later crop this because I know I'm not going to like the photo exactly how it is right now. And then having my Canon R5, it's been really fun to try out video too. It has 8K video capability. So now when I'm up on a scene, I ask myself, should I shoot images or video to best capture this scene? And I'm still playing around with video editing. That's still kind of one aspect I have a lot to learn about, but it's been fun to just capture a lot of video and try to, once it's a whole new world, really, like trying to capture a scene on video versus just a single photograph.
And what are some essential items that every wildlife photographer needs to have with them other than a camera and lenses?
Wildlife photography is pretty unique in the sense that you might be on a scene with variable weather conditions. You might be out somewhere all day following wildlife, or maybe going on a hike to like go track wildlife down. So I would definitely recommend like sunscreen wherever you're at. Even in the winter time too, just the sunlight reflecting off the snow could cause burns, as skiers and snowboarders know. Bug spray as well. You never really know if you're just gonna like come up on a like swarm of mosquitoes. So I carry bug spray everywhere. A hat as well. And bear spray, especially if you're photographing around Wyoming, that's bear country. So I always have bear spray on me, even if I'm just going to be a couple meters off the road, or if I'm just going to do a hike for only 20 minutes. You never know if you're going to run into a bear or not. And then for more backcountry trips and long-term trips, I would recommend getting a Garmin InReach, and that way you can still let people know where you are or call emergency services or text friends and family if you run into something bad and you don't have service out in the woods. So I just feel have peace of mind having a Garmin with me, especially when I'm on backpacking trips where I know I'm not going to have service. So I just know that I have a way to reach the outside world if something goes wrong.
Are most of your photos taken with a tripod or handheld?
Most are actually handheld. Within Yellowstone, too, I feel like I'm constantly on the move, and I like to have my camera in my passenger seat just in case something, runs across the road and I don't have time to set up. So I would say 95% of the photos that I take are handheld, but I do have a Gitzo Mountaineer tripod with a fluid head that I got this year, and it's actually been fantastic for videos. So if I'm shooting something that I know I can like stick with for a while and I really want that fluid motion with my camera, that's been a game changer for sure.
What techniques do you use for post-processing your images?
So like I was saying, I try to keep my photos mostly true to life as I took them. Obviously, sometimes with setting issues or lighting, what have you, you're going to need to do some post processing. So most of the adjustments I do are just like color enhancements or light adjustments, dodging and burning certain parts of a photo to maybe bring out a particular mood if I'm feeling a little bit more like creative with this photo. And I mostly just use Adobe Lightroom for that. Sometimes Photoshop if I just need to adjust like twigs or branches or size and whatnot. But typically, I don't spend more than like 5 to 10 minutes editing a photo.
Where can listeners go to find your work?
So I'm most active on Instagram. My handle there is Rylee_J_photo. I also have a website, RyleeJphoto.com. J is Jay. And my Etsy shop, same name, under Rylee J Photo. And I'm also working on that website for Ursus Expeditions. It'll be called ursustours.com. So look for that soon. And yeah, you can also reach me by email at riley.j.photo@gmail.com.
Great. And I got to say, I did look through your photos and my reaction was just, wow. I was impressed.
Thanks.
So anyway, it was really great having you on the show. Thank you very much for being a guest on here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been fun.
You have a great day.
You too.
This has been the Wyoming Photographic Podcast, all things photography in the state of Wyoming. Thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.